4 decades before he became the first president of the United States, and 2 before he led the Continental Army, George Washington was an unknown Virginia surveyor, chasing rank in a world of colonial rivalries. In the spring of 1754, the young Washington rode into the frontier wilderness of the Ohio country, sent to push out the encroaching French. It would be his first taste of battle. What happened next, young Washington could not have known. He was about to fire the opening shots of a war that would consume the entire world. Historians would later call it the 7 Years' War, the first true world war. This is the story of how one ambitious young man lit the fuse. George Washington was born at Pope's Creek Plantation, Virginia, on February 22, 1732. He was the 4th generation of a Virginia family whose colonial roots dated back to 1657. His father, Augustine, was often away on business, so his greatest influence became his older half-brother Lawrence, who returned from schooling in England in 1738, polished and aristocratic, an instant role model for 6-year-old George. In 1740, Lawrence joined Virginia's provincial forces in the War of Jenkins' Ear, serving in the Cartagena expedition. He returned to Virginia in 1742 and settled at Little Hunting Creek, where George visited often, captivated by his brother's stories of war and distant places. In April 1743, Augustine Washington died, leaving behind extensive lands, 49 enslaved people, and an iron mine. As the eldest son of Augustine's first marriage, Lawrence received the largest share, including Little Hunting Creek, which he renamed Mount Vernon in honor of the admiral he had served under in Cartagena. George and his siblings inherited Ferry Farm and several tracts of land near Fredericksburg. He spent his teenage years taking lessons to become a land surveyor, determined to build his own independent path in the world. By 1747, he was working as an assistant to licensed surveyors, earning his own independent income for the first time in his life. He came under the patronage of William Fairfax, a landowner granted by royal charter nearly 5 million acres of Virginia. The Fairfax's English-educated son and heir, George William Fairfax, became fast friends with Washington. In March 1748, the two joined a survey expedition to chart out Fairfax lands deep in the wild Shenandoah Valley. The expedition was long and difficult, with the team moving through cold, wet weather across the rugged terrain of the Shenandoah Valley, testing the young surveyor's endurance at every turn of the trail. It was during this grueling trek that Washington had his first encounter with Native Americans, an experience that would shape his understanding of the frontier for years to come. With this experience behind him, Washington spent the next few years performing lucrative survey jobs for the Fairfaxes. But in the spring of 1749, Lawrence fell seriously ill with tuberculosis, a sickness that would return again in 1751. That September, George accompanied his ailing brother to Barbados, hoping the warmer climate might ease his worsening illness. Nothing helped. On July 26, 1752, Lawrence Washington died. Ownership of Mount Vernon was split between his widow and George, with full title finally passing to him in 1761. George was devastated, losing the elder half-brother he had always looked up to and strove to emulate. With the untimely deaths of his father and half-brother, George Washington was now owner of a substantial plantation in Virginia's northern neck, granting him firmer standing with the colony's gentry planter class. With his surveying experience, higher social status, and connections to the Fairfaxes, Washington came to the attention of Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, who in the fall of 1753 would task the 21-year-old with a mission of great importance. In the years after the 1748 treaty, ending the War of the Austrian Succession, the French had increased their military presence in New France, changing their grand strategy for colonial expansion across North America. Along with Canada, the French controlled lands west and south, down the Mississippi to Louisiana, using the rivers of the Ohio Valley to connect their territories and hem the British colonies against the Atlantic coast. Beginning in 1749, the French built strategic forts and trade outposts throughout the Ohio River Valley, alarming the British colonies, particularly Virginia, which had aggressive designs of its own on the region. Virginia's interest was embodied by the Ohio Company, founded in 1747 by wealthy planters including Lawrence and Augustine Washington, which held a royal charter for over 500,000 acres in the Ohio Valley. The company hired surveyor Christopher Gist to scope out the best places for settlement, and through his pathfinding work, secured permission from local tribes to fortify a trading post at Logstown. This expansion alarmed the French. In 1753, the Governor-General of New France ordered troops to build a new string of forts, strengthening the line of their upper Ohio frontier. Posts were established at Presque Isle on Lake Erie and at the head of French Creek, Fort Le Boeuf, where troops built riverboats to push deeper into contested territory. From there, the troops floated down French Creek and seized the British trading post at Venango on the Allegheny River, a direct provocation neither side could ignore. Governor Dinwiddie now had permission to build his own forts in the region, but only after first proclaiming to the French that the land rightfully belonged to Virginia. Should diplomacy fail, he was authorized to repel them by force. Though winter was approaching, Dinwiddie chose Major George Washington of the Virginia Militia to deliver the message. Washington departed Williamsburg on October 31st, 1753, traveling with guide Christopher Gist through heavy rain and early snowfall. They reached Venango on December 4th, where French officers openly boasted it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio, leaving no doubt at all about their intentions. Washington and Gist pressed on to Fort Le Boeuf, arriving after dusk on December 11th, where Washington delivered Dinwiddie's formal ultimatum to the post commandant, Captain Legardeur de Saint-Pierre. After a day's deliberation, Legardeur handed back a diplomatic but firm written refusal and sent the Virginians on their way. Their mission complete, but the answer they had feared. Traveling through rough, snowy terrain and across ice-swollen rivers, Washington finally returned to Williamsburg on January 16, 1754, and hurriedly wrote his report to the governor from his notes. In early 1754, Dinwiddie sent Captain William Trent with 100 men to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio, the confluence of 3 rivers where Pittsburgh now stands. An arrangement was made with the local Mingo people, led by Chieftain Tanagrisson, the half-king, who sought to boost his own standing within the Iroquois through trade with the British. The Virginians had barely started construction when French soldiers forced them out and built their own post in its place, naming it Fort Duquesne, the most strategic point in the whole valley. Meanwhile, newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel Washington mustered around 130 men into the Virginia Regiment, setting out from Alexandria on April 2nd, 1754, cutting roads through the wilderness as he marched. His men would build roads and outposts until reinforcements arrived under Colonel Joshua Fry, who was to assume command. By May 24th, they reached a clearing 50 miles north of Wills Creek, the Great Meadows. 4 days later, Mingo warriors joined them under Tanagrisson, warning that French soldiers were camped nearby. Washington took 40 men along a narrow trail through the dark night to meet the Half-King's warriors. Conferring with the Half-King, Washington decided to attack the French troops bivouacked below in a rocky ravine. Using the high ground, his men and the Mingos surrounded the camp on the morning of May 28, 1754. Who fired the first shot of the 15-minute battle is still unknown, but the Virginians quickly fired off a musket volley straight down into the French camp below them. The Virginians fired just 2 volleys before the French threw down their arms in panic and ran. only to be cut off by the waiting Mingo warriors at the ravine's edge. They turned back and surrendered to Washington. 10 Frenchmen were killed, 1 wounded, and 1 escaped, while 21 soldiers were taken captive in the confusion. The wounded French commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers, the Sieur de Jumonville, showed Colonel Washington his orders, which clearly explained he was on a surveillance mission with no hostile intent. But as his letter was being translated, the half-king approached the wounded Jumonville and spoke to him quietly in French before raising his tomahawk. Tanagrisson swung the tomahawk down over the Frenchman's head and scalped him, a brutal act that shocked every soldier present, Washington included. The other warriors immediately began killing and scalping the wounded French prisoners, much to the stunned surprise of Washington, who had not expected this at all. Despite now sparking a serious diplomatic incident, Washington had just experienced his first taste of real battle, and to his own surprise, he found it exhilarating. He would later write to his brother John about the skirmish, "I heard the bullets whistle, and, believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Washington led the remaining French prisoners back to his camp at Great Meadows, sending them onward to Virginia under armed guard. Back at camp, he put his troops to work building a timber fort in the meadow, a fortification that would very soon be tested by a much larger force. The completed palisade, named Fort Necessity, surrounded a small storehouse for powder and supplies, with rifle pits and earthworks dug carefully around it. Washington received word on June 6th that Colonel Fry had died in a horse-riding accident, making him senior officer of the Virginia Regiment. 3 days later, reinforcements brought his numbers to 300 men with 9 swivel guns. On June 14th, a 100-man unit of South Carolina regulars arrived under Captain James Mackay, who quarreled with Washington over command, arguing his Crown Commission outranked Washington's provincial one. The regulars built a separate camp. Word soon reached the camp. 600 French and Canadian soldiers, bolstered by 100 Allied warriors, were advancing on Great Meadows, a force well over twice the size of Washington's own. The advancing force was led by Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, the older brother of the slain Ensign Jumonville, marching north to avenge his brother's death. As Washington's starving, exhausted men hastily strengthened their earthworks, morale inside Fort Necessity began to crack under the mounting pressure. The half-king, seeing no path to victory, grew frustrated with their dire prospects and led his Mingo warriors out of the Great Meadows entirely, abandoning the camp for good. At 9 in the morning on July 3rd, 1754, Washington received reports that the French were near. He had just 300 men fit for duty, a quarter too sick or starved to fight, against roughly 700. At 11 o'clock, the first shot of the Battle of Fort Necessity was fired into the woods by a nervous Virginia sentry, and the French began to emerge from the tree line. Having learned his tactics from European drill books, Washington led his regiment out of their earthworks to form disciplined ranks in the open meadow, expecting a conventional battle. But the French refused to fight that way, firing ineffectively from 600 yards and staying hidden along the tree line. Washington ordered his men back into the rifle pits. From behind their entrenchments, the Virginians and regulars exchanged fire with the French for hours, as Canadian and native allies crept to within 60 yards to snipe at them. The native warriors tried to charge with tomahawks, but a Virginian volley sent them reeling back. Just as dark storm clouds began rolling in overhead, a sudden torrential downpour broke over the battlefield, flooding the trenches into pools of mud and soaking every musket and cartridge on both sides. With the day closing and ammunition ruined by rain, the firing from Fort Necessity gradually died off as exhausted soldiers slumped in their flooded trenches. That night, the French opened negotiations, sending an officer forward under a flag of truce, while Washington sent 2 men to meet him on the middle ground. They returned with 2 copies of a surrender document written in French. Washington and Captain Mackay pored over the rain-soaked papers by candlelight in the fort's storeroom. Jacob van Bram, a Dutch-speaking officer in the regiment, strained to translate the soiled terms for the 2 officers, working carefully by flickering candlelight. The terms allowed Washington and his men to leave the Great Meadows in peace, taking any belongings they could carry, while surrendering their swivel guns and muskets to the French. Washington would be granted full military honors, and the French would occupy the vacated fort. 2 captains of the Virginia regiment would remain behind as hostages until his prisoners from Jumonville Glen were exchanged. Washington agreed to every term but the surrender of muskets, given their long withdrawal through hostile native territory, and Captain Villiers agreed to let them keep their arms. With the terms before them, Washington and Mackay both signed the papers, unaware that the second line of the document had him effectively admitting to the assassination of Ensign Jumonville. The next day, July 4th, 1754, Washington and his men abandoned Fort Necessity, surrendering their first command post under the beating drums and waving flags of full military honors. The battle had cost Washington 30 men killed and 70 wounded, while Captain Villiers' losses amounted to just 2 French and 1 native killed and 17 wounded. The next morning, the beaten Virginia regiment, with Washington at their head, began their long march home, as the French torched Fort Necessity to the ground behind them. Governor Dinwiddie was far from pleased at Washington's return, immediately trying to put out the fires he had inadvertently started in an urgent letter to the Crown. Washington's unintended admission to murdering Ensign Jumonville damaged Britain's moral claim to North America, and when the French captured his journal, they translated and printed it across Europe, painting the British as the aggressors. What no one could realize was how that first unclear shot at Jumonville Glen would become the spark for the 7 Years' War, breaking out 2 years later, a small frontier skirmish that reshaped the world for the rest of the century.